In my career coaching powerlifters, I've had many of them reach triple bodyweight deadlifts. And I've had to do a lot of work to get their technique dialed in so that their third attempts look just as crisp as their openers. And I want to explain to you why the most brutally effective strategy that we've used for fixing deadlift technique doesn't rely on better cues, and why that's actually going to be a waste of your time right now if you've already got the basics and you can make your warm-ups look good. So let's talk about cues for a second here. Now, most cues are going to make your deadlift look good at lighter weights, but as soon as you get up to kind of any amount of weight that's going to make you nervous on the bar. So let's say you're a mid 400 pound deadlifter, anything like 425 pounds and up is probably going to do the trick there. And realistically, what's going to happen is you're going to lose your back position, or you're going to rush your wedge. And either of those two things is going to lead to you missing that PR attempt, because the bar is going to get out in front of you and your ass is going to shoot up in the air. Maybe you round over as well. Maybe that beats you up. There's a lot of other things we can see here. And that lack of precision is in direct contrast to the amount of elite athlete precision you need to pull elite deadlift numbers like a triple bodyweight deadlift. So here's what happens, okay? Let's lay out a situation here. So lifter's gonna go to the meet, they're gonna miss their third attempt deadlift, they're gonna be super bummed about it, and then they're gonna go watch the video on replay like 100 times, right? They're gonna micro-analyze this and look at like what went wrong, what did I do wrong, and they're probably gonna come to the conclusion in looking at their deadlift technique that, oh, well, okay, I just didn't wedge enough, my hips are too high, whatever it may be. I need to stay more connected to the bar, and so like whatever it may be, ultimately what I'll see happen really often is either in their next training block, they'll really focus on the cues that they should be focusing on to keep this wedge, or they'll have done some research to find some new cues to add into their routine. And I don't know about you, but when I get more than about one thing to think about when I'm lifting, my head feels like it's going to explode, right? And so then they'll practice their setup more deliberately. They'll probably even do some like more research on technique and try to learn more about, okay, like how do I pack my lats more? How do I wedge my hips more? And get this sort of obsessive technical focus with the lift, when the reality is their technique is already fine at what they can control consciously and what they can think about as they're executing on the lift. But then they're gonna get to week, let's say 8 or 9 in that training block as things start to get heavy again after a meet. And suddenly what they're gonna see is they're right back at square one, where it's like a 50-50 shot if they can keep their wedge and hold their back position as things get into that 85, 90% range. Again, like getting over about 400 if you're that mid 400 pound puller. And they'll basically end up with 3 top sets on their deadlift or 3 singles, and they look like 3 different people doing a deadlift. But the reality is what's really going wrong here is that they're thinking about using cues because if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And the problem with that is that at those PR levels of intensity, when there's that much weight on the bar and you've got 455 for a 5-pound PR, your brain is basically gonna shut off. You're gonna go full monkey mode, and your body's gonna find the most efficient path from point A to point B, right? From the floor to lockout. And you're just gonna finish the rep or you're not. And if you're thinking too much, you're either going to be able to preserve technique with really light weights and stifle yourself because you're trying to think your way through the entire rep, or you're just gonna miss groove again. So I want you to reframe how you think about cues, right? Cues are a common language that we're all gonna use to understand the intent of how we're supposed to feel and execute the movement, right? It's like a doorway into good technique. Basically, you're trying to explain to your brain how to use your body correctly. And when you're telling yourself, for example, when you're trying to wedge in, pull your lats into your back pocket and really create a little bit more extension to wedge, at 80, 85%, that's gonna give you some access to some movement patterns that you're strong enough to do regardless of whether you're peaked, right? But as we get closer to 100%, let's say even 95, 96, 98, whatever it may be, those high percentages, the main constraint that we're gonna deal with is our physical capacity, not our mental capacity. And so what I mean by this is that your body is gonna understand that the task is to go from the floor to standing up, right? And you're gonna have a bunch of different options to do this. So if you were to think, I could walk straight to the camera to put my face in the lens, or I could zigzag across the room and take a very meandering path. Might not be efficient, but all accomplish the task. And so this is why if you are in that sort of mid-upper 400-pound deadlift range, you might be able to have a pretty clean, 405 to 425, but as you get into the mid-400s or a little bit closer to that at like 425, 445, 450, that's where things start to fall apart. And so what actually is going to build your ability to have the cues that you're using at lower percentages carry over into your strength at higher percentages is going to be your supplemental and your accessory work. And this is going to be something that deliberately exaggerates the hardest component of the movement for you, right? And so we're probably familiar with this with like pause deadlifts or tempo deadlifts or eccentric deadlifts, which are all variations that are going to force you to spend more time under tension, right? Now, this term gets misused a lot with like bodybuilding circles. We're not necessarily trying to chase, more hypertrophy with these movements. What we're trying to do is building your ability to hold position without deviating from our ideal spot. And so we're basically spending more time greasing that groove and learning, okay, precisely where do my knees need to be? Precisely where do my hips need to be? And can I maintain that as I strain? And the advantage with those movements where we are manipulating time is that we don't have to go super heavy to get a similar amount of strain. So it's not gonna beat you up like a 1 rep max deadlift attempt is gonna do, where you're probably gonna do that every couple of months at most, whereas you can train a pause deadlift every week. And so I've got 2 lifters right now where every like 3 to 4 months we'll actually run a 5 count pause block as a deliberate way to kind of break off the rust. This is like the block we do right before their last meet prep block. And it works super, super well because 1, we replace their primary movement with pause work. And I'm talking, they're literally doing like 5 count pause squats and 5 count pause bench instead of the main lift. And it gets their technique feeling so solid before they go into that final peaking block that we've just invariably had PRs every single time we do this, because the PR weights feel almost fast compared to doing a set of 4 or 5 reps with a genuine 5 count, right? I'm talking like 60 beat per minute metronome, count 5 clicks. And so if you're finding that between your second and your third attempts, your technique does change and you feel like half the time you are getting that misgroove and it's like a gamble basically if you're gonna get it, even though how the second attempt moved or 95%-ish of what you're trying to take for a PR is going well. The secret sauce here is not gonna be a new cue, but it's in being more deliberate with how you're selecting the movements that are gonna develop specific traits in the lift. And that's where you're gonna build the ability to have 500 look the same as 365 instead of having your technique change as the bar weight goes up.